So you might have heard of a very important hormone called leptin, which is really heavily involved in body composition, essentially because its role is to stop us from gaining weight and gaining more fat. It's going to stimulate satiety so that we don't keep eating. It's going to stimulate the breakdown of fat tissue for energy, and it's essentially going to stop the production of new fat tissue. So because leptin is released from fat cells, it makes sense that the more fat cells that we actually have, the more leptin we're going to release. And this is something that makes sense biologically, because if you have a lot of fat, you're going to want to stimulate the release of more leptin so that you don't continuously create more and more fat, so we don't just get abnormally obese. Of course, if you're very, very lean, you're going to produce less leptin, which will then stimulate those mechanisms less. You will want to eat more so that you can have a bit more fat, and etc., so we don't keep breaking down fat tissue. But there are some other mechanisms that control leptin aside from how much body fat you have, and they can actually play quite a big role and muck this whole system up. So much like the mechanism behind, for example, insulin resistance, if you have too much of a certain hormone, for example, in the body, like leptin, the body will come back to homeostasis or find homeostasis by downregulating things like receptors for that hormone. This is very useful because even though you might have a huge abundance of a hormone in the system, by downregulating the receptors, obviously, then it's not going to overstimulate the downstream effects of that hormone. So this is quite useful in the body. So it makes sense that if you have a huge amount of body fat, this is probably going to happen because you have this excess amount of leptin. But there are other things that can actually stimulate the downregulation of receptors for leptin. And one of those big things is inflammation. And what do we know about inflammation? We know that a diet overly rich in processed carbohydrates is going to stimulate inflammation and therefore stimulate the downregulation of receptors for leptin.